Lamentations chapter 4 for our study this evening. Well, we bid farewell to a familiar friend. For the past 52 Thursdays, we have been considering the words of the prophet Jeremiah. Yeah, it's been that long, folks. We started Jeremiah chapter 1 on April 1st, 2004. It's taken us a year to get through the words of this prophet. A man that you will remember was known as the weeping prophet, and for good reason. Jeremiah saw things and experienced things unlike things that you and I may ever experience. And he did it not just once, but twice. You see, Jeremiah saw the judgment of God fall not just once, but twice. In other words, the first time he saw the judgment of God through visions and revelations that God gave to him that he might speak warning to the people, beseeching them to turn their hearts to come back to God. And so Jeremiah, as it were, experienced that through the visions and revelations that God gave him. And then secondly, true to God's word, he saw the judgment of God fall. He saw the Babylonian armies come through and conquest the land, destroying everything in sight. And so Jeremiah lived through these things not once, but twice. I think you would agree that it's hard enough to see tragedy, to experience trauma once, but man, twice? And so remember, we find ourselves as we come to these concluding chapters this evening, the year is 586 BC. Babylon has conquered. Jeremiah is probably perched on a hill outside of town. Some believe that hill to be Calvary, overlooking the smoldering ruins of the city, when he writes these words beginning in verse 1 of chapter 4. How the gold has become dim. How changed the fine gold. The stones of the sanctuary are scattered at the head of every street. The precious sons of Zion, valuable as fine gold, how they are regarded as clay pots, the work of the hands of the potter. Even the jackals present their breasts to nurse their young. But the daughter of my people is cruel, like ostriches in the wilderness. The tongue of the infant clings to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The young children ask for bread, but no one breaks it for them. Those who ate delicacies are desolate in the streets. Those who were brought up in scarlet embrace ash heaps. The punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment with no hand to help her. And so again, we get a sense, we get a feel for the desolation in which the land finds itself. As Jeremiah sits overlooking the destruction of Jerusalem, remembering what's once stood prominent in the landscape as the temple, the glorious dwelling place of God, God in the midst of his people. Now we read in verse 1 how its gold, how its stones were strewn about the streets like common refuse and rubbish. Jeremiah remembered the glory days of Israel. He remembered the grand days where God would meet with the high priest behind the veil. He remembered the sacrificing of lambs and goats for the sins of the people. All of that, no more, as the city lies in ruins. And so he says in verse 1 how the gold has become dim. How changed the fine gold. The stones of the sanctuary are scattered at the head of every street. You know, it's a sight not much unlike what some of us saw as we traveled back to Ground Zero after 9/11. I'll never forget that day, the first day that I popped my head up out of that subway in the financial district of Manhattan there, and there it was. The smoke, the stench, the sight. I mean, our first trip back there was in November, and so it was still a pile rather than a pit. And you could see all of the metal and all of the destruction. It was just overwhelming. And that's the sense which fills Jeremiah's heart here as he looks upon the city. But not only the destruction of the buildings, but notice he says in verse 2, how the precious sons of Zion, valuable as fine gold, how they are regarded as clay pots, the work of the hands of the potter. In other words, the vitality, the vigor, the youthfulness, the young men that once stood as golden vessels, if you will, are now regarded as nothing more than common clay. The judgment had filled the land. Even the jackals present their breast to nurse their young, but the daughter of my people is cruel, like ostriches in the wilderness. You see, hunger and starvation had so filled the city by the time that the Babylonians conquered, that you will remember that we spoke in previous studies about how scholars believe more people died from the famine and from the disease and the pestilence than actually died at the hand of the sword of the Babylonian conquerors. We see just how desperate the conditions were, because Jeremiah says, even the animals act more naturally than my people do. You see, in the face of starvation, everybody was withholding and trying to just fill their own belly. And so the prophet says, the daughter of my people is cruel, like ostriches in the wilderness. And you know, I didn't know this about an ostrich before studying for tonight's message, but apparently an ostrich is the kind of bird, and he's particularly noted here in this text, because an ostrich is the type of bird that has absolutely no concern, no care for its young. I didn't know that. Ostriches are known to lay their eggs in the sand of the desert and then wander away, never to return to them again. The warm sand is what will incubate and ultimately hatch the egg, and those young ostriches are left to fend for themselves. And that's what God is saying was true of His people in these desperate, dark days of the Babylonian conquest. It was every man for himself. They gave no thought for the young. They gave no thought for the handicapped or for those that were unable to take care of themselves. The tongue of the infant, continuing in verse 4, clings to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The young children ask for bread, but no one breaks it for them. Again, everybody is out just for number one. And I sometimes wonder, though we don't face famine, though we don't face hunger and starvation in our country, if that same attitude sometimes doesn't fill our hearts and our minds. Watch out for number one. Don't care about anybody else but yourself. Just take care of yourself. Those who ate delicacies are desolate in the streets. Those who were brought up in scarlet embrace ash heaps. In other words, those who lived high and mighty were suddenly living among the heaps of refuse. Those who once enjoyed the best delicacies that the land had to offer now find themselves wandering in the streets. You know, we've seen a recent example of that in our own lifetime in the toppling of Saddam. A man who lived high on the hog, huh? I mean, when you looked at some of the palaces that he had constructed for himself there in the land of Iraq, when you look at the lifestyle that he lived, and when you consider where it was that the U.S. soldiers found him hiding in a pit under somebody's house in Tikrit. I mean, he had gone from eating the finest foods of the palace, living in the sumptuous surroundings of royalty, all at the expense of the common folk there in Iraq. And when the conquest was complete, he found himself hiding for his life in the bottom of the pits. The punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people, verse 6 says, is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom. Now, wow, imagine, listen to what God's saying here. The punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment with no hand to help her. I mean, that's incredible to me. I mean, Sodom was one big marshmallow, man. Just poof, went up in smoke. Remember the story? You know, the angel of the Lord was crossing across the plains on his way to warn Sodom and Gomorrah what was going on when he encountered Abraham. And as the angel began sharing with Abraham what was going on, or what was headed for Sodom's future, you remember the story. Abraham, knowing that his nephew Lot was in Sodom, began bargaining with the angel of the Lord. Kind of an example of what a lot of us do on the streets of Mexico or some of the other places, you know, where you just kind of barter back and forth. You try and talk them down and talk them down. That's what Abraham was doing with the angel of the Lord, man. Well, if there's 50 righteous, are you going to judge the city? Do I hear 40? How about 30? He got down to 5. And even then, we see from the account of Genesis how God delivered Lot and his family out of the city before judgment fell. And as swift and as sure as that judgment was, God says here that the judgment that came upon Jerusalem was far worse. You see, the reason I believe it was far worse, even as is noted in the scripture here in verse 6, is Sodom was overthrown in a moment. I mean, it was like they almost didn't know what hit them. One minute they're out there partying and feasting and having a good old time, when the next minute, man, they're a bunch of crispy critters. I mean, it's almost like somebody set off a nuclear device or some such thing. I mean, it was instant. It was sudden. It was quick. But Jerusalem was a different story. The Babylonians had laid siege around the city, remember? As they came to conquer the city, it wasn't a quick thing. Actually, a year and a half, 18 months from start to finish. And the people were languishing. And the people were beginning to just kind of wane away. God says, man, the people of Sodom had it better than you folks, as Jerusalem fell after 18 months of being surrounded by the Babylonians. Her Nazarites were brighter than snow and whiter than milk. They were more ruddy in body than rubies, like sapphire in their appearance. Now, their appearance is blacker than soot. They go unrecognized in the streets. Their skin clings to their bones. It has become as dry as wood. Those slain by the sword are better off than those who die of hunger. Interesting. And we give thought to that in light of some current situations that I'll comment on in a moment. Those slain by the sword are better off than those who die of hunger. For these pine away, stricken for lack of the fruits of the field. The hands of the compassionate women have cooked their own children. They became food for them in the destruction of the daughter of my people. The Lord has fulfilled his fury. He has poured out his fierce anger. He kindled a fire in Zion, and it has devoured its foundations. The kings of the earth and all inhabitants of the world would not have believed that the adversary and enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. Again, some very picturesque and some very vivid description about what was going on in the city as the judgment of God fell. We see in verses 7 and 8 how the robust and the whiter than snow and the ruddier than ruby kinds of guys, I mean, whoa. You know, the Mr. Universe, the Olympians, the Hulks, you know, the studs, whatever you want to call them. These very stately masculine men, as starvation sets in the city, are seen in verse 8. Their appearance is blacker than soot. Their skin clings to their bones. It's become as dry as wood. I don't know if you've ever seen somebody that is starving to death, but that's actually what happens. And while I have not seen it up close and personal, I have seen pictures, like many of you, especially from countries like the Sudan, where tens of thousands are dying of starvation. And you watch how as starvation sets in, you know, the skin begins to discolor, and the different kinds of symptoms, as are being described here, take place. And their life, even as verse 9 goes on to say, their life just kind of pines away. It just kind of wastes away. Those that die by the sword, the prophet says, are better off than those who die of hunger. And of course, you all know where I'm going with that in light of present situation. How appalling it is to me that we find ourselves in a situation tonight where every appeal that I am aware of that could possibly have been made has been exhausted in trying to spare the life of Terry Schiavo. And though there isn't a one of us in this room that knows Terry, I want to share with you that her plight, her situation, should concern every one of us in this room. Because it's nothing short, in my estimation, in my opinion, of euthanasia. Of just killing off people who otherwise have viable lives. Now, I understand the conflict that's going on in the ethical, the medical, and the legal community. You know, it all boils down to her parents pitting their wishes against her surviving husband, who said that her wishes were to never be supported by artificial life support. And of course, the big debate is a feeding tube, artificial life support. Most people that I'm reading and most people that I'm studying are saying that is not artificial life support. She's not on a ventilator. She's not on anything that's keeping her body functioning. We are simply nourishing a perfectly healthy human body. And in fact, some have argued that had medical care not been withheld from Terry, as has been the case over the years, she would probably be speaking. She could possibly be ambulatory. There could be functions that she would be able to be doing better for herself than her present condition because of the withholding of medical and therapeutic assistance. And again, at the risk of getting on my soapbox, as you know I'm so prone to doing, the reason that this troubles me is because it sets a precedent. It sets a precedent in this country that I don't believe we want to go there. It sets a precedent that we will starve a perfectly alive human being in the name of whatever, conscience or whatever you want to call it. And the thing that is scary about that is who's going to decide when you or I should go. If you or I are on a feeding tube, or if you and I are otherwise receiving some kind of assistance. I'm not talking life support. I don't know what your personal wishes are, my convictions are, and I've shared this with my wife. You know, if the brain is dead, if it takes a machine to keep me alive, I'm already with Jesus anyway. Don't bother. You know what? Just don't even plug the thing in. That's my personal conviction. But that's not the case with this gal. And I'm concerned that this is charting a course, this is setting a direction for America that we have seen other societies in the past already go with devastating consequences and results. And so having shared that with you, you may differ, you may have differing convictions. Bottom line is, God says, you know what? Those who die by the sword are a lot better off than those that starve to death. And I just have a difficult time thinking that, you know, in the name of justice and equity and all the rest of this kind of stuff, we are starving an otherwise living, healthy human being there in the state of Florida even tonight. And unless something has happened in the 11th hour here, I'm not aware of anything that's going to probably change the situation there. It looks like that, as comments have already been made of her health deteriorating, that she's going to go. As Christians, I think we can pray that the Lord would take her before she would starve to death, because we certainly see that those who starve, what a brutal, brutal form of death. And again, unthinkable that we who pride ourselves on compassion and on humanitarianism and all the rest of these things would do that. But we got to go on, because I could just hang in verse 9 and keep talking about that. Verse 10. And I mean, as you read verse 10, this obviously stuck out. This just resonated in the mind of Jeremiah. For he says that the hands of the compassionate women have cooked their own children. They became food for them in the destruction of the daughter of my people. You know, somebody's well said that desperate times bring desperate measures. In other words, when things are really bad, people get really bad, you know? I mean, people will do things that they otherwise wouldn't do under ordinary circumstances. And we've heard the stories of people that have been, lost at sea, that somebody in the lifeboat dies and the next thing you know is they're cannibalizing on them. That's what's happening, folks. And I mean, this was so incredible that it just stuck in the mind of Jeremiah, for he's repeated this over and over again in his writings. He's like, guys, you don't know how bad it was. You can't imagine how desperate it became. Moms were cooking their own children and eating them. I can't imagine that. And yet that's exactly what was happening in the days of the Babylonian siege and conquest. The Lord has fulfilled his fury. He's poured out his fierce anger. He's kindled a fire in Zion, and it has devoured its foundations. Catch this, verse 12. The kings of the earth and all the inhabitants of the world would not have believed that the adversary and the enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. I mean, it was common knowledge. All of the enemies of Israel knew that, man, you don't mess with God's people. You mess with God's people, you're messing with God. And it became pretty understandable among the pagans that that's what happened. You remember the story how when the Philistines came into possession of the Ark of the Covenant, the Israelites took it out to war, thinking that it was going to be their good luck charm, it was going to bring them victory. Instead, the Philistines captured the Ark, set it up in the pagan temple of their god Dagon, and as we've commented before, their idol god, fish god, seemed to have these little tizzy fits. He kept falling off his pedestal. They'd pick him back up, and he'd fall off again, and they'd pick him back up, and finally the last time he fell, he was like Humpty Dumpty, man. They couldn't put him back together again. And so finally they said, rather than worship the God of the Hebrews, we got to get rid of this box. They still wanted to cling to their pagan deity rather than acknowledging that there was a God that had come into their midst that was mightier than theirs. But the knowledge existed and the understanding was widespread that you don't mess with Israel. Because every foe, every adversary, and every enemy that had sought to conquer, that had sought to war, that had sought to overthrow Israel, found themselves at the hands of defeat, didn't they? And I mean, we see some pretty dramatic battles described in the Old Testament between the pagan civilizations and the people of God. I think of the time that Gideon was going to go to battle. And you remember how the Lord told Gideon, you got to trim your army down. Remember that? And so the ranks of Gideon kept diminishing and diminishing and diminishing. And then I think of probably the most vivid account of God protecting his people there in 2 Kings chapter 19, where we read as the Philistines were, actually it wasn't the Philistines, it was, who was it? It was the Amalekites, Assyrians, were encamped around the people of God. There in 2 Kings 19, in one night, the angel of the Lord, we're told there, wiped out 185,000 of Assyria's mighty men. How he did that, I don't know. But I mean, 185,000 soldiers slaughtered in one night. And so it was common knowledge, hey, don't mess with Israel. Now, there are some nations that would do well to learn that lesson today, wouldn't you agree? And again, at the risk of getting back on my political soapbox, I must confess that I am a little concerned about what's going on in the Holy Land today. What's going on in the Holy Land today is the same thing that was being tried 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I found myself sitting on an El Al Israeli jetliner flying overseas to Tel Aviv, sitting next to an Orthodox Jew, asking him, Yoav, so what do you think about your prime minister's actions? What do you think about this ideology of conceding land for peace? Giving land to the Palestinians in the hopes that they will stop bombing and assassinating and executing and shooting your people. Yoav, what do you think of what your prime minister is doing? And I'll never forget what he told me. He said, Brian, if I had a gun, I'd shoot him in the head. I'm like, whoa, this is a Jew telling me that he would shoot his own Jewish prime minister because of that kind of action. The conceding of land for peace and the futile hopes that the Palestinians and the Arabs will stop picking on Israel. You know the story. It wasn't too many months later that Rabin was assassinated there in the land of Israel. Not by a Palestinian, but by a Jew, by a Hebrew. And the thing that so upset the country was the fact that one of their own took up arms to assassinate their prime minister. And here we are 10 years later, revisiting the same subject. I don't know what the ultimate ends will be, but I got to tell you, folks, that I'm concerned about the consequences that are sure to follow. The Palestinians are never, I repeat, never going to be at peace with Israel. Their agenda, as with the Islamic community, as with the Arab community, as with all of their neighboring country, is to exterminate the Jew and to push Israel right off into the Mediterranean Sea. And until that happens, there will be no peace in that land. You see, back in this day, when the Babylonians conquered Judah and Jerusalem, the rest of the world went, wow, we wouldn't have believed it if we hadn't have seen it with our own eyes. I mean, everybody that took up arms against Israel, everybody that sought to overthrow and defeat the Jews went down, were sorely defeated. Even to the point where God intervened and interceded for them, wiping out, like I said, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. It was well known that you don't mess with them. And I've shared with you before, and I share again tonight, that whenever somebody asks why I believe that there is a God, I simply say, Israel. Israel. Israel is proof positive that God is alive and well and still in control of the affairs of this world. He's watching out for those folks and will continue to until Jesus Christ sets foot there on Mount Zion. And so the kings of the earth, all the inhabitants of the world, verse 12, wouldn't have believed it, that the adversary of the enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. Whoa, fasten your seatbelts. We've got 15 minutes to finish 2 chapters here, folks. Because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests who shed in her midst the blood of the just, they wandered blind in the streets. They defiled themselves with blood so that no one would touch their garments. They cried out to them, "Go away, unclean, go away, do not touch us." When they fled and wandered, those among the nations said, "They shall no longer dwell here." The face of the Lord scattered them. He no longer regards them. The people do not respect the priests, nor show favor to the elders. Still our eyes failed us, watching vainly for our help. In our watching we watched for a nation that could not save us. They tracked our steps, so that we could not walk in our streets. Our end was near. Our days were over, for our end had come. Our pursuers were swifter than the eagles of the heavens. They pursued us on the mountains, and they laid in wait for us in the wilderness. The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of the Lord, was caught in their pits, of whom we said under his shadow, we shall live among the nations. Now listen, folks. Notice to whom God holds responsible for the fallen state of his people. Because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests. Do you see that there in verse 13? Folks, the buck stops here. This is who God holds responsible for the fallen state of a people. And I am concerned that even as we see America falling headlong into carnality and compromise and sin, who is God ultimately going to visit over that subject with? But the church. I believe he's put the church in America as a light upon a hill, as the salt of the earth. But as Jesus taught us in the gospel, if the salt has lost its saltiness, what good is it? But to be thrown out and trodden underfoot by men. If the church no longer stands for righteousness, if the church no longer preaches and practices the truth, then what good is the church? Move over, Elks Lodge. Here we come. Because we've just become another social order. And so God holds accountable those spiritual leaders that should have been pointing the people to Jesus, should have been pointing the people to God, should have been nurturing their faith in the Lord, but instead they had become perverse, they had become corrupt, they had become carnal, they had become sinful. And because of that, the people fell. The people fell into the reproach and the judgment of God. We see how in verse 15 they cry out like lepers, "Go away, unclean, unclean." Remember the story? That was the cry of a leper. Anytime there was a leper, first of all, the lepers weren't allowed in the city. They had to camp outside of town. And anytime people would approach, in their caravans or in their travels up and down the highways, if you got within so many feet of a leper, he had to go through the ritual. He had to go through the spiel. Unclean, unclean. And that's what the people of God are here seen quoting. They sound like nothing more than a leper, the uncleanness of a leper. God has scattered them, verse 16 tells us. 17 tells us how their eyes failed them, watching vainly for help, because they were looking for a nation. Do you see that there? They weren't looking to God. They were looking to man. And anytime you look to man to save you, anytime you look to man for help, you will be disappointed. You will experience what they did. Their eyes failed. They watched vainly. And that's what we do when we look to the arm of man rather than the might of God to save us and to deliver us. And so we see how they feel like they're being hunted down there, verses 18 through 20, man. They're tracking their steps. The pursuers are swifter than the eagles of heaven. The breath of the nostrils of the anointed of the Lord was caught in their pits. Finally, verse 21, "Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, you who dwell in the land of Uz." Notice that, Uz, not Oz. This isn't Dorothy and Toto, okay? "The cup shall also pass over you, and you shall become drunk and make yourself naked. The punishment of your iniquity is accomplished, O daughter of Zion. He will no longer send you into captivity. He will punish your iniquity, O daughter of Edom. He will uncover your sins." Now you have to understand that the Edomites were actually descendants of Esau. And as descendants of Esau, who you know to be Jacob's other brother, they didn't have a real friendly relationship. In fact, early on, they hated each other with a passion, to the point where when Jacob finally was going to try to get right with Esau, he sent on a caravan loaded down with all kinds of trinkets and goodies and basically tried to bribe the beneficiariness of his brother. But from that point, even in the womb, man, we saw how there was this turmoil, how there was this conflict. And it only got worse in real life when Jacob stole the birthright, and the blessing from his father. And there was no love lost between these groups. And so now that Israel has fallen by the judgment of God, the descendants of Esau, the Edomites, are like, "You got yours, didn't you?" And they're rejoicing. We see there in verse 21. We see how they're glad over what's fallen. Their kinsmen. When God says, "Oh, don't rejoice." Because in verse 22, he says, "You're going to get yours." And folks, it's an important point to remember. How do you respond when you see a brother or sister fall? How do you respond when your enemy fails? When someone that you don't particularly like, maybe a coworker, someone that stabbed you in the back, someone that's hurt you deeply, man, when they get theirs, they really get it. How do you respond? That's our carnal tendency, isn't it? It's like, yeah, go God, give it to him. But I am reminded of what Jesus said over in Matthew chapter 7 when he said there, the measure by which you judge others is the same measure by which you yourself will be judged. And so when I see my adversary, when I see my foe, when I see my enemy get theirs, I have to be very careful not to rejoice over that. Because I realize that, whoa, I may be getting mine right around the corner. And if that same measure that God gives to them is the measure I say, yeah, baby, let them have it. Oh, how I don't want that same yardstick applied to my own life. And so we see how the Edomites are going to get theirs. Be very careful about rejoicing over the calamity of your adversary. Quickly, chapter 5, and we'll close tonight. Remember, O Lord, what has come upon us. Look and behold our reproach. Our inheritance has been turned over to aliens. Now, this isn't preaching Martians and that kind of stuff, okay? Foreigners might be the better word. And our houses to foreigners. We have become orphans and waifs. Our mothers are like widows. We pay for the water we drink, and our wood comes at a price. They pursue at our heels. We labor and have no rest. We have given our hand to the Egyptians and the Assyrians to be satisfied with bread. And so here's the cry of the people of God. Lord, remember us. They're thinking in their captive state that maybe God has forgotten all about them. And they're like, Lord, remember what's happened to us. All that we worked for, all that we built up, all that we had hoped to be an inheritance to our offspring are now being enjoyed by our adversaries, by our conquerors, by our foes. That which they had worked so hard for had been turned over to their enemies. You know, that's why I kind of subscribe to the bumper sticker you see on RVs up here in the summertime. It says, I'm spending my children's inheritance. I kind of like that. Not that I have much of an inheritance to leave, but a bunch of bills my kids anyway. Sounds like most of us in this economy of these days. But seriously, you know, when you go, you're going to leave it all behind. Every bit of it. Oh, they tried to stuff it in the tombs of the pharaohs and the Egyptians, you know, the pyramids and the great tombs of the ancient world. But you know what? Guys like Indiana Jones and all the rest of those dudes have uncovered that stuff, and it's all still there. They didn't enjoy a bit of it in the afterlife. The expression is, you can't take it with you. And so we see how these folks are saying, oh God, look at us, man. Our inheritance has been turned over to aliens. Our houses to foreigners. We've become like orphans. We pay for the water we drink. I mean, it's like unthinkable. All that they had enjoyed free of charge by the grace of God, now they find themselves being taxed and charged. Nothing is free anymore for these people. Our fathers sinned and are no more, verse 7 continues, but we bear their iniquities. Servants rule over us. There is no hand. There is none to deliver us from their hand. We get our bread at the risk of our lives. Sounds like they shop at Walmart. Because of the sword in the wilderness. I mean, if you've been at Walmart during the daytime, it's an absolute zoo there. But seriously, these folks are really going through it. They're saying there's no one to deliver us from the hand. Servants ruling over us. And some have noted that servants who ascend to the throne are especially ruthless and vile and wicked as rulers. Our skin is hot as an oven because of the fever of famine. They ravished the women in Zion, the maidens in the cities of Judah. Princes were hung up by their hands, and elders were not respected. Young men ground at the millstones. Boys staggered under loads of wood. The elders have ceased gathering at the gate, and the young men from their music. The joy of our heart has ceased. Our dance has turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Catch this. Woe to us, for we have sinned. Ding! It's like the light bulb, the proverbial light bulb has gone on, huh? After going through all of this at the hand of God's judgment, they're like, oh, hello. It's our own fault. We brought this upon ourselves. Really? Jeremiah's only been telling you guys that for 42, 43 years by now. Nobody was listening. Your false prophets were saying, nah, they're never going to set foot in this city. God's going to smash their teeth, yeah. And here they are, captive in Babylon. Their city in destruction and ruin. And they're like, oh, mamma mia. Our sins have brought this judgment on us. It's sad that it's taken us 52 weeks of studying the words of Jeremiah to finally come to that point. But I sometimes wonder, are we any different? Sometimes I think it's like, hello, anybody home? God has a real dense project on his hands when he tries to work with me. It's like, I don't get it. I don't see it. The Lord is there tapping, sometimes booting, trying to get my attention. And it's like, huh? You talking to me? That's these people, man. We come to the end of all of these things when they finally say, woe to us, for we have sinned. Because of this, our heart is faint. Because of these things, our eyes grow dim. Because of Mount Zion, which is desolate with foxes walking about on it. You, O Lord, remain forever. Your throne from generation to generation. Why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? Get this, verse 21. Turn us back to you, O Lord, and we will be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are very angry with us. You see, verse 21 reminds me of Jesus' words to the church of Ephesus there in Revelation chapter 2. When he says, turn back. Turn back. I have this against you. You've left. Not that you've lost. You've left your first love. Turn back. Remember. Repent. And be restored. And that's what these people are saying. Turn us back to you, O Lord, and we will be restored. Renew our days as of old. Ah, the good old days. That's suddenly becoming very cherished to me. The good old days. Because I'm beginning to realize that things that I grew up with are now suddenly collectibles. You want to start feeling old? Just realize that the ball cards that we used to buy off of the ice cream truck in the neighborhood, man, some of those things are now worth thousands of dollars if I'd only kept them. Yeah. The Matchbox cars I used to race with in my mom's living room. Doing the loop-de-loops down those little vinyl strip tracks. Remember that stuff? My goodness, what are they worth today? The dolls that my sister played with. The things that we grew up with now suddenly are nostalgic, vintage collectibles. And with each passing year, it's like these things become a little more antique. And I realize that the only thing that's becoming antique in my house is me. Whoa. The good old days. I remember the good old days, and you do too. We all have those precious, cherished memories of the good old days. Remember those nickel ice cream cones at Thrifty's? Oh man, won't find that anymore. Yeah? Remember the Saturday afternoon matinees for $0.25 at the movie theater? Goodness gracious. You wouldn't even want to send your kids to most of the movies that are shown on the screens today. But as the people are in these desperate straits of the Babylonian captivity, their minds go back to what it was like when God was in the camp. What it was like when the Shekinah dwelt behind the veil in the temple. What it was like when they watched the Lord move in their midst in all his glory and grandeur. And they realize how they lost it all. All they could do is say, Lord, remember us and turn us back to you, and we will be restored. Now, We've come to the end of the book. But please understand that this is not the end of the story. Who is it, Paul Harvey, who says, and the rest of the story? Well, for the rest of the story, now I want you to turn back to the book of Psalms and chapter 126. For we are now going to look at the rest of the story as we conclude the book of Lamentations. And I don't know about you, but I'm ready to conclude the book of Lamentations. I love Jeremiah. I can relate to him in so many ways. I mean, who among us doesn't know what it's like to preach your heart out to a loved one and they walk away looking at you like you're a bozo? They just don't get it. There isn't one of us in this room that hasn't had that kind of an experience. Jeremiah did that with his entire countrymen and didn't see a single convert. And yet Jeremiah stood as a man of uncompromising, unwavering faith and courage. No matter what they did to him, they couldn't shut him up. Lock him in stocks, throw him in the dungeon, beat him, whip him, threaten to kill him. None of that would shut this man up. And while we come to the end of the book, here's the rest of the story. You know that after 70 years of captivity in Babylon, the Hebrews were released. Cyrus came to the throne. Daniel showed him how he was spoken of by the prophets of old before he was ever even born, and how he let the people of God go and return. And this is what's being described for us in Psalm 126. When the Lord brought back the captivity of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, our tongue with singing. And then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad. Bring back our captivity, O Lord, as the streams in the south. Those who sow in tears, catch this, shall reap in joy. You see, elsewhere in the Psalms, the psalmist describes how God actually bottles our tears. He takes note of every one that falls from your eye. Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. He who continually goes forth weeping, bearing seed for sowing, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. I mean, the Hebrews were like, it's party time. We're going home, folks. This is the land that we love. And so they are seeing here really the end of the story. And until Rome would come in 70 AD and conquer the land once again and set them into what became known as the dispersion. The Jew, unique among all the peoples of the world, in that they are the only group that has been dispersed as many times as they have been and still have retained their identity and are back in the land, just like God said they would be. In order for Jesus to come, the Jew had to be back in the land. Why do I believe that we're living in the days that we'll see Jesus coming for the church? Because his prophetic word has been fulfilled. Exciting times indeed in which we live. Look up, folks. Our redemption draws nigh. Will you stand with me as we pray this evening?